Hey, welcome to the inaugural episode of the 48th Fighter Wings podcast, Liberty by Trade. I'm going to be your host, Major Kevy Rake. I'm the Chief of Public Affairs here at the Wing. And today, for our very first guest, we have the honor of welcoming Dr. Brendan Mulvaney. He is the Director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute at Air University and a retired Cobra pilot. So, welcome, Dr. Mulvaney. Do you want to start just real quick explaining a little bit what we'll call Cassie probably throughout the podcast, so I don't mess that up. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that as we get into it?
So first, I like to emphasize we are a U.S. Air Force organization, right? Which is important because I work for the government. So happy to come out and do this. And thanks for having me. This is a great opportunity to come up here. So Cassie, everyone that works at Cassie speaks and reads Chinese, right? That's the minimum entry. And we do open source, publicly available information research on everything that flies in China, is what we like to say. And so China has the same kind of, they have newspapers and they have, Airspace Power Journal, the, Air Force Times, all the same kind of stuff they have in China, right? And including now, obviously, websites and social media. Right. The problem is that our intel agencies are undermanned and overworked and just don't have the time really to dig through all of that stuff. And so that's what we do. We do open source analysis. We collect all the data, we look at it, we see what the trends are. And I like to tell people that the Chinese are good communists. What I mean by that is that they like to plan. But in order to execute that plan, they have to publish the plan. They have to let people know what that plan is and then how they're tracking on that plan. And so that gives us a lot of insights as to kind of the broad brush, right? So they're obviously not going to tell us what their new super secret cyber weapon is. And they're not going to talk about space capabilities. But in the broad term, in organizational people and training, and strategic thinking, there's really a lot to be had in the open source. And so that's kind of the niche we like to fill. And really, we take a broad view of aerospace. They're organized a little differently than we are. So obviously the Air Force is the predominant, but we look at naval aviation, we look at Army aviation. For them, rockets and missiles is a whole separate service, and so we look at that. We look at space and cyber, which for them is a separate force. And then because it is China, it is the People's Republic under the Communist Party of China, we look at the entire aerospace industrial base that supports it because the vast majority of that is state-owned or at least influenced heavily by the party. And so it really is a holistic system with whom we're competing, and so that's what we do. Okay,
and that's really interesting. You mentioned that, because under General Brown's Accelerate, Change, or Lose, and he is saying that the Air Force really needs to develop a deep institutional understanding of China and their military. But absolutely, with the public available information and open source intelligence, I know even here at the 48th Fighter Wing, we don't have time to do it all. And then it's, who does it fall under? Does it, we do a little bit of it as, kind of the information warfare public affairs team, but then so does Intel. But it really does usually take a back burner. So that's, we could definitely relate there, but you get so much from it. And as we look at trying to understand, China as an institution, as a country, as a military, you speak Mandarin, but I don't know one single other person that does. And I tried my hand at it one time, and my professor told me just to stop because I couldn't get the tonality correct. But is that what you see, maybe what we're missing, or what is going to limit us in our understanding is, our lack of language capability and really lack of like a Chinese cultural, political, military acumen. I don't know that we know as much about China as we probably think we do. It's just your average airman. And then Chinese history, I think I would be curious to know, what we were taught kind of about Chinese history, growing up, or about China in general versus how they see their history. And I know in a previous podcast you talked a little bit about like kind of their last 100 years and the Opium Wars. But what do you think our biggest challenge in developing that deep understanding would be?
Yeah, all great questions, and I think you started off on the right foot about the open source stuff, and that's one of the great things I love about my job is because it is all publicly available, right? I get to come and do things like this for the public. I get to talk to our friends and our allies and partners who are absolutely going to be crucial for this fight, and just kind of raise the institutional understanding, right? So I'm a little bit older than most of your audience. I actually studied Russian literature and Soviet studies when I was in college because it was back in the Cold War days, and I tell people, when I was a lieutenant and a captain, I knew something about the Soviet military, even though there was no longer even a Soviet Union, right? And we just are not to that level on China. Language is certainly a difficulty. When I started, it was a challenge. Again, I took Russian in college, had no background in Chinese before I started learning and to go over there, which, by the way, if you need it to get food and water, is probably a pretty good impetus for studying. The good news is that in the modern world, there are a lot more tools that we have available now that are starting to make the Chinese language, right, the Chinese character set, a little bit less intimidating to the modern generation, right? And so there's Google Translate, there's all sorts of tools and online things and things that are starting to make that more feasible. One of the things that we at CASI are trying to do is we've started a series called In Their Own Words, which because as you mentioned, you don't speak Mandarin, so you're reliant on somebody who does, like me, to go and find something, to read a whole bunch of stuff, to pick out what I think is interesting, then for me to translate it, and then for me to put my spin on it and put it out in an article. And that's what you end up reading. We think that it's much better if you can go to the source material as much as possible. And so we take the doctrinal pubs, the theoretical pubs, the grand strategy pubs that China has produced, we're translating them, turning them into English so that English language speakers are, around the world and throughout the force have access to that and can actually see what the Chinese are talking about. And so that we're hopefully making a little bit of a dent there. It is still obviously a really big challenge, but like I said, there are ways around it. And there's all sorts of companies popping up, especially with the improving computing power and machine learning, things like that, that hopefully will start to bridge some of those gaps.
Well, and I think that's I'd be incredibly interested to look into those, because it's, while you're giving your perspective on what was written, that gives us, as somebody who doesn't understand the language, the culture very well, contextual data and contextual translation. So that, and for the listeners, we'll try to find some of those and put in the show notes.
They're all up on the great thing about the open source, right? They're all on our CASI website. So if you Google CASI and Air University, it's the first one that pops up. That series is called In Their Own Words. Everything is available PDFable. If you're into PDFs, you can read them on a Kindle or an iPad. If you want a hard copy, we're happy to send you some as well.
Okay. So some people out there might still prefer one.
They like the pen and ink. So.
And on that, we're kind of the information warfare arm of this wing, which is kind of more and more becoming honestly a buzz phrase in the Air Force, because our information operations career field is still very new and we don't have any here yet. So I was interested to hear how you think the Chinese perceive information operations and then our larger joint information campaigns, and are we being effective? What do you think?
And this hits on something, whether you know it or not, that actually tees me up for one of the things that is kind of a fairly significant difference between the United States and China, is that China looks at the information domain as a domain of war. It is equal to the air, the land, the sea, and space these days, right? And so they created this new force called the Strategic Support Force. It puts together their space and cyber operations together, so they kind of created their Space Force before we did. But it's specifically to act and take the lead in the information domain. And so they see this as critical, and they have a much broader view of it. So for them, electronic warfare is part of the information domain. Cyber warfare is part of the information domain. And they are actively, what some could say, at war, certainly conducting active operations in that. And it's one thing that I don't know that we as the DoD holistically understand, that these things are inherently political. The PLA is not the military 100%. Of China, but it's the armed wing of the Communist Party. They're doing things for political reasons, and that we need to really, really understand that. I think it's great that we've taken some steps, like you mentioned, creating information information operation officers and things like that, trying to come up on step with this huge challenge, but really. The communists, the whole tenet is to propagate. They have a propaganda department in the literal sense to propagate their message, and that's covertly, that's overtly, that's diplomatically, it's internally, it's domestically for them, as well as externally. And the PLA has an active hand in all of that.
Oh wow, interesting. That's and maybe not as much in this theater, but when we're talking about so essentially they can use IO on their own people, which we obviously don't do and cannot do. And so personally, I've experienced that in conflict, with, if you think about the Taliban and their nefarious use of Twitter or ISIS and their videos. And as frustrating as it was to try and counter some of that when your hands are more tied, I think it's interesting looking at it in a competition lens versus a conflict lens. And often we'll tell leaders that we get bumped up against that sometimes in the information space because some of our more pacing challengers, competitors, they don't have the same restrictions we do. So we're kind of finally coming up, and we have a new information warfare category, amongst officers specifically. You have your rated pilots, and now we get rated against other Intel and EW. So I think that for me, in my mind, is going to be an interesting challenge to overcome. At least while we stay in a competition phase, and hopefully that's the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I and I agree with you. I would not trade our Constitution for their system, but it does have some strengths, and we need to understand what those are and how best to compete against that, right? The example I use, and I've used this a lot, so forgive me if you've heard it, but I tell people you can get somebody from military intelligence and from the CIA and from the NSA and from the FBI and a local police department to sit down in a room. We could do that.
Right.
It would take a year and about 1,000 lawyers, but we could do it. For the PLA, they just simply pick. They're doing it today, right? It's just SOP for them. Again, we have firewalls and we have restrictions and laws, all for very good reasons. But when we look at the competitor, they're just in a different spot than we are. There's strengths and weaknesses to our system. There's strengths and weaknesses theirs. We just have to better understand what each of those is. So
and they really use the public diplomacy and psychological warfare and legal warfare. I guess that's how they categorize their different types of warfare. Do you mind kind of explaining that a little bit?
Sure.
I understood it a little bit, but I was interested to somebody that's the expert here in the room.
These are referred to as the three warfares for China, and this is really kind of encapsulates the whole political nature of the PLA, right? Because they do think of, okay, how are we going to use the international legal regime to the PLA's advantage, right? So the PLA looks at things and say, how do we use UNCLOS? How do we use the United Nations? How do we use some of these wonky things like the International Telecommunications Union, right? Which do really nitnoid stuff that nobody really cares about, and the United States is really kind of paid short shrift to. But they get into these organizations, which allows them to set standards and to set norms. You think about data. Data is one of the more important strategic assets going forward, and how China manages, utilizes, regulates its data of its citizens or data flowing into China, right? These are all things that they are thinking about, at the national strategic level, because they understand the nexus there. And again, it feeds into their information domain, and that's why they pay so much attention to it, right? And so it's a different way of looking at it. But you have to understand the holistic system that it's working in. So it's great that we are trying to step up our own and figuring out how we're going to work with those information spaces. Right. One of those things that I think we need to think about really hard is going forward in a conflict, or even in competition. You talked about the Taliban's use of Twitter. Hey, that's a perfect example. But what's the next step? The next step is, and I was telling a general this. I'm not going to go after him, but I'm probably going to go after his aide. Right? Because if I take out the aide, the general becomes, very impactfully. And in the modern world,
always the media officer.
It is, right? But so if you're deployed, right, but your husband gets a letter from USAA that says, "I'm sorry, we're foreclosing on your house because you haven't paid your mortgage." In the modern world, you are immediately going to know that within probably hours, no matter where you are on the globe, right? And whether that letter is true or not, maybe China can make that true, right? Maybe they can close your account or something, or if not, they can certainly make it look like it. That'll cause you some stress, that takes away from our mission effectiveness, and those are very targeted attacks that are very likely, if not today, in the not too distant future. And so that's kind of the next step of information warfare on our side, because of those restrictions we talked about. Who's responsible for that?
Right.
Are you in the military responsible for that? Is the NSA responsible? Is the FBI? And how are we thinking about going forward? And what is that going to do to affect us?
We don't always we talk about the whole of government approach, very, very often, but it's, one of those, it's easier said than done, I think, sometimes, certainly. And so interesting enough, I know later today we're going to talk a little bit more about the European theater in China and how they affect each other, but it's interesting you mentioned that those things could be going on, and we may or may not know that it's a targeted attack. And I think a lot of people are just now realizing with everything going on with Russia invading Ukraine, you're now starting to hear the deep fakes and information and, targeted information attacks where they maybe didn't think that much about it before, maybe paying more attention. But in this theater, it's at least what we're hearing is that there is kind of a downward trajectory of European and Chinese relations, largely because of concerns about Taiwan and then also some human rights violations. Do you see that largely to be true, or? I know it's very broad, but I didn't want to get into anything that is maybe not for an on-camera.
No, sure, but it is. So Europe, as you all know, living here, although now no longer part of the EU, right? Right. It's a large and complex thing, and there are a whole host of countries that have a whole range of relationships, right? So the ones in Southern Europe and Greece and things like that have a different relationship with China than, say, England does, who has a different relationship than, say, Germany or some of the Eastern European countries. And so it's kind of, over the last decade or so, China has really tried to make inroads toward Europe and trying to, what they like to do kind of just as a broad brush, they like to pick apart alliances and organizations and deal with one-on-one countries because they think then they have the upper hand. So if you compare China to the EU, they're on par, and the EU is probably even bigger and more important. If you compare China to Poland or China to Greece, that's a completely different thing. They do this in Southeast Asia, right? They do it in Europe, and so their approach has been largely to interact with individual countries and to try to pick them apart, pull them to their side if they can get countries to bandwagon with them, or at least turn a blind eye to some of these challenges that you talked about in the relationship, and they had done a fairly good job of that. Over the last couple of years, we've seen the Europeans kind of really see the hand of the state and the hand of the party behind a lot of those things, right? With the discussions about 5G, the discussions about what's going on in Xinjiang, as you mentioned. And now kind of their tepid reaction to what's going on in Ukraine, and the EU and NATO and Europe's just in general kind of coming together to say, hey, this is not right, this is not what we do in the modern world. And that's really caused a little bit of a break with China. So we'll see how long. Again, it's complex, right? Because just, so Germany very displeased with what's going on with Russia, but kind of dependent on them for, gas and oil. And so China is definitely integrated in the modern world, and it's going to be hard to completely separate them, but I think that they've seen a downtick in those relations because of those things, and that's only been in the last couple of years.
Man, yeah. So I know that was a very broad, question and hard to really get, down into it with the little bit of time we have, but it's certainly interesting as we kind of watch this, the geopolitical space unfold a little bit. I know you said, you studied Soviet Union back then, and now that map looks completely different. Yeah. But what principles still hold true?
Well, and I mean, I think just the consequence that we're even talking about China in Europe, is a result of China's burgeoning economy, right? Their multi-decade decision to develop their economy, to develop their military, to secure their strategic interests around the world, and to go out. And part of that is the Belt and Road, which we'll talk about later today. And part of that is just this overall diplomatic effort to try to ingratiate themselves across the world. And it's not just Europe, but it's also in Africa and Central Asia. And so we're starting to see them, in a lot more places, in a lot bigger role than they had been, right? So in the 80s and the 90s, after they did the reform and opening period by Deng Xiaoping, the economy grew and started to blossom. But at that point, they were still a very small economy. They were still fairly backward military, and they had very limited objectives and aims, and really were just trying to grow. Now that they've come to become the #2 economy, 1.4 billion people, by some measures, the largest navy, if not by tonnage, then by numbers, right? So they're now truly a global competitor. And so just that fact has changed the nature of the relationship around the world, including in Europe.
Yeah, well, honestly, I didn't even know they had a navy. So that shows. So I think General Bryan was probably right. We probably do need to understand them a little bit better. I listened to a podcast that you did a while back, and you talked about that they have very similar recruiting kind of issues, especially in the STEM, and AI capabilities to get people into their military. Do you mind explaining that a little bit?
And this is absolutely one of those things that you'll never find, or you rarely find in the intelligence record, because Again, they're overworked and it's not one of the things. But if you pick up, the most recent copy of the Air Force Times, you'll probably hear about all the stuff, the great stuff we're doing, the newest missile, how we rename it. But you're also going to read about, who got relieved. You're going to read about a pilot shortage, right? About manning issues, and the challenges that the U.S. Air Force is facing, right? The PLA has all those same challenges, and as they try to move from a ground-based, backward force to a modern military, they face a lot of these challenges. It's easy to take a guy with a 9th grade education, tell him the pointy end goes that way, give him an AK-47 and off they go. It's not so true when you're trying to work on a J-20, right? Their version of the F-35. It's not so true when you're working on an aircraft carrier, when you're tasking satellites or writing computer code. And so they have all the challenges to getting these people into the PLA. They are also competing with a large, prosperous, we'll call it a commercial sector for lack of a better term, right? Private enterprises and things like that in China that are not in the military or the state. And so their work, and this goes especially true, they have the officer problem. It's true 10 times bigger on the enlisted side and the NCO side. And so how do you get them to come in? How do you get them to want to come into the PLA? Entice them with a little bit better pay. You entice them with some of these programs. They're trying to get more college students or graduates to, we'll say, enlist for the American audience into the PLA. And how do you get them, because you need them, if you're going to continue to do all that. And they face all those challenges.
And do they have like a conscript kind of
program? So the technical answer is everyone is conscripted into the PLA on the enlisted side, every single person. But you can volunteer to be conscripted. So that's kind of where but under Chinese law, everybody is a conscript. So by hook or by crook, if they don't meet their quota for whatever their recruiting district is, they will actually go out and pick people and say, look, you're next time. It's kind of like a draft number. Kind of like a draft number, right? But they really do try to entice people to come in, and they've come up with a couple different programs. They're expanding their NCO program. They actually have some programs that if you come in as a college student enlisted, they have some, we'll call it direct commission into NCO programs, that when you go back to college, you can change your major, which doesn't sound like anything to an American student who changes his major 4 or 5 times in his freshman year. But for them, it's a big deal, right? Because when you go to college, you take this crazy hard test that tells you what colleges you're even allowed to get into, and it tells you what majors you can do. But if you enlist in the PLA for a number of years, you can go and change your major, right? They have some student loan repayments, and some of these programs, much like, kind of like we're trying to do, right? You see the post 9/11 GI Bill, you see all these things to grow that force and the requirements, the tech savviness of that force. And so we see them trying to compete with that. They're doing a fairly good job. They have some good recruiting tools but it's still a challenge for them because, like I said, Apple or Xiaomi or wherever is still probably going to pay better than life in the PLA. So they have to figure out how do you increase that prestige and the perks of being in the PLA.
Yeah, absolutely. And for us too, with the kind of the tech challenge, we do get a little bit of a generational challenge. I mean, we have some leaders that struggle, to save a PDF, and I don't mean to, make fun, but it really is. It's, where a lot of us grew up before there was any tech, and then going, to almost an all tech. And maybe that makes sense why we put more focus on, the weapons, the missiles, the airplanes, depending on which service you're in, rather than the tech. But and I think also for some of those generations, those organizations seem more palatable, because they're a little bit like they could just kind of. It's not as militant. I think a lot of younger people come in and are like, I don't want to be in the military, even if it is to do, tech data or AI, up and coming. Because I think for some, I will just say older generation, it's still a little bit daunting, and they're uncomfortable with a lot of it, without realizing how much it really is, in kind of in everything that we do. We still are afraid to be chipped, but we're carrying around one or two of them at least in our pocket at all times. And so, do you know much about China and kind of their push toward AI?
This is one of those things that they are absolutely all in on, right? And it goes back to the whole part about being a communist, right? So
they feel seems like they're much more comfortable with it.
Well, one of the central tenets of communism is that life is scientific. It's knowable, right? And if you collect enough data and you have the right equations or algorithms or whatever, then problems are all solvable, right? So their doctrines, their publications that we talk about are called the science of strategy, the science of campaigning, the science of this, the science of that, because they at their core believe believe that if you gather all that data, you can eventually solve those problems.
Okay.
And this is why they are absolutely all in. They have huge tech centers or data centers out in Guizhou and around the country. They have absolutely poured billions into AI and machine learning, high power computing, the next generation of chips, quantum chips and communications, all because it's feeding this need and this desire to reach that level where you can use all of that data, right? And we talk about the differences, so in Chinese there was a saying that, the road is long and the emperor is far away, meaning kind of like, well, Beijing will do what Beijing is going to do, but it's not really going to affect me now here down at the province or the city level. That's largely changing because of the technologies that we have, the capabilities to reach in, to monitor people. Like I said, everyone's carrying around a cell phone. I know where you are. In China, they have the social credit score. They have facial recognition to a degree that I think would scare even the most authoritarian people in the West, just to understand just the proliferation of these things that are now the Communist Party has at their disposal. And so that's really one of those things. And keep in mind, China's problems are not just external. Right. They have 1.4 billion people. They've lifted 300 million people out of poverty, which is an amazing number if you think about almost the population of the United States. But that doesn't mean that everyone's out of poverty, right? They have a huge disparity between East and West. They have environmental challenges, pollution challenges. They have a huge demographic wave because of the one-child policy, which they've recently changed. All of these things are things that keep Xi Jinping up at night, right? And so it's probably not till the end of the day that he starts worrying about the United States and global strategic interests. He's worried about how do you feed the people, how do you get them to improve their lot in life and to make their lives better than their parents' lives, better than their grandparents' lives.
Okay, so we probably are putting too much thought into into them worrying about us.
Oh, they certainly do worry, and that is one of the challenges that we kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? So after 9/11, we shifted our focus, right? So we shifted our focus kind of away from the Soviet threat, away from the post-Cold War, into this new thing, right?
Yeah.
China really has not ever lost focus. It came into clear depiction for them in 1991 in the first Gulf War, how far behind and how much they needed to catch up. And since then, they have been laser focused on the United States, on the U.S. military. And I will say that they look at us both with a little fear, with a little trepidation, but also as a role model, right? And they are not afraid. They are not afraid to take lessons learned and best practices and things that we come up with and apply them. In fact, in 2015 and 2016, they did a huge reorganization. And now, if you looked at their structure, you would say that models the United States, because now their services do something which we would call man, train, and equip. They call it force construction. And they created these theater commands, which look very similar to combatant commands, that are going to be the warfighting organizations that now have dedicated forces under them. Now they only go to the confines of what the PRC sees as the confines of China. So they're not global as our COCOMs are. But it was a massive reorganization because they saw this is how the U.S. fights. This is how the U.S. fights with its allies and partners. This is what we're going to be faced with in the future. And this seems to be what works for the 21st century modern warfare. And so they are not above studying very deeply, understanding the trends of history and the leaders, and then making adaptations to their system. We make the joke that they always call it with Chinese characteristics, but that's really kind of what it is, right? So this is the American system with Chinese characteristics.
That makes sense. And within those, they're the COCOM-like structures. You mentioned they do one of those is like an information.
Well, command? So the Strategic Support Force supports all of the theater commands, right? So this is a national level force that is meant to integrate across and then coordinate with obviously the Central Military Commission and the leaders in Beijing, right? And so it is a holistic force meant to, so there's going to be SSF officers at each of the theater commands, as well as throughout the services, and then leading back to the SSF so they can coordinate those things, because they understand that that the information domain is bigger than a theater, right? Which kind of just gives you that, right? It just shows it. So the theater command's in charge of, so for example, we assume the Eastern Theater Command would be in charge of any conflict over Taiwan or in the Straits there. But the SSF is going to support that, as well as the other theaters that are doing all the other supporting options at the same time.
Okay. And is the East, are they more built up there around?
Yeah, of course. So naturally, the eastern coast of China, because it is their coastline, that's where you see a lot more of the buildup. Obviously, directly across the Taiwan Straits, more missiles, more airfields, and things like that. But obviously, there's still a lot going down to the South China Sea. Still a lot around Beijing, the capital, which is right across from the Korean Peninsula, which is not always stable. You've got their strategic rival Japan. China lives in a dangerous neighborhood. They have an active border conflict with India. India's got nuclear weapons. They have a relationship with Pakistan, who has nuclear weapons. Although they have a warming relationship with Russia, the Russians have nukes. And during the Cold War, the reason that we even have a relationship with China is because they were afraid the Russians had a plan to nuke them, which they did. Well, we found when they opened the archives, we found that they literally did, because they came. They had a shooting war. And so the Chinese live in a dangerous neighborhood. So yeah, most of them are, or a lot of them are concentrated down over Taiwan, but they are definitely mindful of all the other challenges that they face from all these other neighbors.
Okay. If you were allowed to give a number probability-wise, if you can, or if you choose to, but realistically, because like with Russia and Ukraine, we were kind of watching it for a while. So I don't know how many people were legitimately shocked that they went in there, but it's probability, or can you say you think China's going to push into Taiwan? Yeah,
so and that's the $1 million question, right? So if I had a good answer to that, I'd be a rich man sitting on Wall Street.
I need that insider info too.
Exactly. It is a stated goal, right? So it's a stated goal of the party by 2049, which will be the 100-year anniversary of the standing up of the People's Republic of China, which is why it's 49 and not some other date, to achieve the great rejuvenation of the nation, which includes, in Xi Jinping's own words, for them, they would call it reunification, right? It's not a reunification, and that goes toward propagating their message, because Taiwan has never been part of the PRC. It hasn't been ruled by Beijing and the mainland since the 1800s. And so this really is, not a reunification. But the Chinese mainland absolutely sees that as kind of the last vestiges of the century of humiliation and the Civil War and the last battle. Xi Jinping would love to be the guy that brings it back. And I will tell you, he would be perfectly happy to never use the PLA. He'd be perfectly happy to use economic means, diplomatic means, and all the other powers of the state to bring Taiwan back. And it really kind of seemed for a number of years under his predecessor, Hu Jintao, that those were warming relationships, right? And that Taiwan might at some point choose to come into some sort of compendium with the PRC. I think we've seen the crackdown in Hong Kong, the new national security law, and all those things have really pushed Taiwan and the Taiwanese public farther and farther away from the mainland. So I think that's more likely trending toward conflict. Now, is it in 2 years? No. Is it 5 or 10 years? Maybe not. It's still a pretty big lift in the PLA. They do a pretty frank assessment, and they understand what their challenges are. By 2049, that's a long way out. We'll have to see how the balance of power shifts across the straits, and what geopolitical things take place, right?
Yeah.
Again,
a
like
lot
you
can
said,
happen in a quarter century.
A couple years ago, you never would have thought there'd be a full-blown invasion of Ukraine, but I think Vladimir Putin was lured by his previous successes, in the Donbass, in Moldova, and the Crimea, and all these things that he was successful for. That he really thought he'd be able to get away with this, and he didn't think the Ukrainians would put up as much of a fight. So I think that's a tale worth learning in Beijing, that the Taiwanese are probably going to fight a lot harder than you think they are. They're not just a whole bunch of Chinese people waiting to come back to the motherland. They do want reunification, but they want it on their own terms and not with the PRC.
That makes sense.
It is hard to get across the strait. It is only across the strait, but it's 100 miles. There's no border like Russia, so you can't roll your tanks across it. It is a challenge. They have the United States to contend with. They have our Japanese allies and our other allies and partners in the region. So it's a big lift for them.
Wow. So at least we have a little bit more time to get more familiar. And it's just coming out of after 9/11, and we didn't get a whole lot of time in between that, and at least for us here, and then now worrying about Russia and Ukraine, keeping an eye on that. So, I felt like we would like to be a little bit more prepared, just for waiting. And again, especially in the information environment. Because like for us, where we work in it every day, not everybody else does. So
well, and I think
it's an interesting domain.
Absolutely. Well, and Xi Jinping totally agrees with you, right? So the General Secretary of the Communist Party totally agrees with what you just said. And they understand that, which is why they're prosecuting. And I think one of the lessons they will take away is just how well Putin did or did not use the information domain. He veiled it enough, and couched it as terms of an exercise or movements that, this is just nothing to see here. A lot of people didn't believe him. But like
Sounds
you
really
said,
familiar, right?
But at the end of the day, we really didn't posture as much as we probably could or should have ahead of time, right? And so he's probably taken some notes on that. He absolutely believes that the first shots of the next conflict are going to happen in the information domain. That may be kinetic in space, it may be through cyber means, or it may just be diplomatic through information, public or non. But that's absolutely where he sees part and parcel. And they even talk about it maybe being the determinant factor in the next war. So I'm glad you guys are paying attention to it here. Super important, because it is definitely going to be a key factor as we go forward.
Yeah, and I think here for us, it may be a little bit easier too, because it's whereas the difference of being here in a base, CONUS, is it's right at our doorstep physically, but then so we really have to pay attention to it a little bit more. So we do our best, but then there's always the battle of what's too much, what's not enough to put out, what's deterrent, and then what's an OPSEC violation.
Sure.
So it's I think hopefully the Air Force, the information warfare spectrum is getting more information, it's getting more people, and getting the right people is another challenge we face. But so we'll hopefully, before 2049, we'll have a little bit of a bigger IW force. But well, Dr. Mulvaney, thank you. I know we're running a little bit short on time, but thank you for sitting down and talking to us. And hopefully, my questions didn't insult your level of knowledge too much. But,
this is fantastic, and this is exactly what General Brown wants, right? And you'll see in the in Action Order C, the updates that come out to it. This is exactly what he's looking for. He wants to build that base of knowledge. He wants to have more people understand what the nature of the challenge is, right? So happy to do this. Like I said, we work for the Air Force. We've got an Air Force website. Please let us know how we can help.
Okay.
No matter where you are, here or across the European theater or really around the world. That's what we're here for. So thanks for having me today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I appreciate everything you guys are doing.
All right, thanks. And then we will drop those links and the PDFs into the show notes for anybody that's interested in reading them. And yeah, thanks
Great.
again. Welcome to our first.
One question.
Okay.
It's just going to be, it's random.
Sure.
What would you say to the airman here stationed at Langley that comes to you, Doctor, I'm stationed in the UK. I thought I was supposed to only worry about Russia. Why should I care about China?
No, it's a good question. Why care, right? Especially here, especially when Russia is the most nefarious actor right here, like you said, on the doorstep, right? So that's an important question. I would say because long term, China is a bigger systemic threat to the United States, to the U.S. military, the U.S. way of life than Russia is, right? So Russia faces a lot of challenges. It's using its military force backed up with some nuclear weapons to try to reassert itself, but it has a failing economy, it has a shrinking population, and it has this feeling that it's no longer playing the role that it used to be able to. China, on the other hand, is a growing economy, is the second biggest in the world, is an expanding military force that is largely, going to be equivalent to the United States by 2049. That's one of their stated goals, is to have a global, world-class military by 2049. Russia's Navy, we see that they have almost no Navy. It's a shadow of its former self. They still produce some decent aerospace, equipment, but even the land force stuff, totally not true in China, right? China is all in across the entire spectrum. And they will have a bigger impact because they are more integrated across the world. They have more levers of power. And so it really is a longer-term strategic challenge to the United States than Russia is today, right? So at the beginning of the Cold War, we had the foresight to see and understand what the Soviet Union, the threat it was going to pose to us, how long it was going to be, what that challenge would be, right? The long telegram kind of laid that out and served as a basic, although there was lots of adaptations along the way. We need to understand what China is going to pose and not get so short-sighted. Russia absolutely is a threat. Iran still poses a threat, DPRK. There's lots of threats out there. The next fight we fight probably, and God help us, probably won't be with China. But that doesn't mean that we can drop our eye off the ball. We got to be prepared for all that other stuff, to reorganize the force for a modern combat, but to keep our eye on China. And not only that, you ain't going to be here in England forever, right? You're joining the U.S. Air Force. They're going to send you all over the world. And it's really important to understand how the Chinese are affecting things here in England, how they're affecting it throughout Europe, and through all the corners of the globe. Because as they try to exert themselves and increase their comprehensive national power, which is the term that they use, they're doing it globally. And no matter where you are, we need to understand exactly what they're doing and how we can combat that and compete against them.
You've been listening to Liberty by Trade, the official podcast of the 48th Fighter Wing. To learn more about the wing and its mission, visit lakenheath.af.mil or connect with us through social media. Thanks for listening.